with that number that was just mentioned, about 6 million hours, we have to keep in context what my colleague from California was talking about here, that we're talking about 2.4 million service members, recognizing that that's what's adding up to this 6 million. One thing that I just find so frustrating about this debate is this kind of casting this cloud as if all the training that our service members are doing is just simply about, you know, these issues that we're talking about here. When we ask our service members, when we ask our leaders about the lethality of our force, I don't think anyone here in this room would say that our force is less lethal, less capable of being able to do the things that we need them to do around the world. And we've seen and been increasing the amount of spending that we're doing in exactly that kind of place. And the other aspect that has come up over and over again is that, you know, it is exactly this debate that we're having right now that is casting this politicization over our military, just this idea that we are thinking about this solely in terms of the political chips that we talk about here in D.C. So I just ask us to be able to move on and be able to push forward and be able to support our troops in the way that we need to.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick.
So as a guy who recently retired from 21 years in the military, spending about 2 weeks per year training on multiple subjects, spent about 4, maybe 5 hours per year speaking about exactly this sort of thing. When you say it doesn't happen that much, when you spend 4 hours, 5 hours talking about how to treat somebody who is different from you, whether it be transgender or whatever, as a physician, what I need to know is what gender you are so I can treat you according to what you need to be saved, to be healthy. I don't need to be told to treat you politely. The amount of time that we spending on that could have been spent making the ER safer, which we did not do. The ER in the military is actually a little bit less safe than it is in the civilian world. We have different training standards. We have more training, but we're less safe. That's the irony of this. If it's not helping us accomplish our mission, if it's not unifying us, if it's not helping us do something better, why are we spending time on it? And that's why I fully support this amendment. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize Mr. McClellan. Ms. McClellan, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking to the amendment, it is simply a fact that 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow had an impact on communities, particularly African-American communities, that manifest themselves today in disparities in health outcomes, that manifest themselves in education that certain communities receive, funding for education and the level of education that they receive. It is a fact that everyone's view of the world is based on their life experience and what they know. And as more people who lived during Jim Crow, including my parents and my aunts and uncles, are dying off, and those stories and the impact are not taught in our schools, the more the impact that didn't go away with a magic wand when the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act were passed, when the military was desegregated, people need to know how policy decisions made during Jim Crow, during an era of white supremacy, still impact people in communities today, particularly if the very communities who were segregated for over 173 years in our armed services, even though the first casualty of the American Civil War was a black man, our armed services were segregated for 173 years. And in many minority communities, they don't view the armed services as a welcoming place.
Well, they're wrong.
And DEI and training on critical race theory helps people who did not grow up learning those stories and those impacts understand how it affects those communities that still feel that impact today. And 2 hours is not a lot of time. Again, that's longer. This committee is going to be multiple times longer than that. If we want an armed services that reflects the full diversity of the country that our members are fighting for to keep safe, then we need to spend some time making sure that everybody understands, particularly in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. But yes, maybe they need to know what critical race theory is. And maybe they need to know why critical race theory was created, to help understand that this country still deals with the impact of over 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow.
Generally yields back, Mr. Fallon of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having been a service member 30 years ago, the armed services is absolutely a welcoming place. And if anybody's saying otherwise, the military is a very welcoming place for all Americans. And I think it's funny that people are laughing that didn't even serve. 30 years ago, the military had always led the way on opportunity. And it wasn't perfect when they desegregated, but I find it interesting that in the first Congress I served in a couple years ago, we watched our military be very politicized by standing down incrementally to talk about and teach about extremism in the military. So I asked a very simple question. Was that something that we should have spent, literally, if you look at the opportunity costs, hundreds of millions of dollars on? So I asked the Marine Corps, how many people did you separate based on extremist activities? Of 222,000 active and reserve, it was 4. 4 out of 222,000. The Army, with almost 1 million National Guard reserve and active, it was 9. It was single digits. It wasn't something that was affecting, and jeopardizing our readiness when we're talking about a handful. It was politicizing the military. We had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs say that he wanted to understand white rage while he was in uniform, and he's white. That is a political statement. We just had a 3-star general in the Space Force talking about what legislation was being passed at the state level. A political comment in uniform. That is politicizing the military. I don't want Democratic generals, and I don't want Republican generals, damn it. I want American generals. And CRT is divisive. You want to talk about history? We should learn about history. CRT is not history. History is talking about the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, of which I was a native of Massachusetts, and proud of that. It was made famous by the movie Glory, or the 1 million African Americans that served in World War II, and then were denied their opportunities when they came back here. That's history. That's something that we need to talk about and embrace to make sure it never happens again. The fact of the matter is there's many people here in Washington that do not want to acknowledge and believe that racism is a diminishing phenomenon every day in this country. And I was reading your amendment, Mr. Gates, and it was a slam dunk. Hell, I thought it might even pass unanimously. How naive, the naivete. It makes complete and perfect sense to acknowledge that the armed services has been at the tip of the spear of inclusion is something that we should all recognize and, quite frankly, celebrate. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I'll yield my time to Mr. Gates.
Yeah,